Chapters 28 to 35 follow the same pattern we observed in 13 to 27, where there are historically rooted oracles of judgment with hints of restoration, followed by eschatological judgment and restoration. This time, the oracles in 28 to 33 are going to be focused not on all nations, but on Judah alone. And there are 7 oracles here in these chapters. Kind of reminds me of the woes from 5 to 10. Each of these 7 begins with a woe, 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 and behold. And of course, the woe is signaling judgment. And what's interesting is that in Hebrew, the word that we translate as woe it's pronounced hoi. And the word behold is pronounced hain. So we have hoi, 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 hain, hoi. Judgment with hints of restoration. And at this point, here in the book of Isaiah, we have shifted from Jerusalem under Ahaz, where the primary concern was the Syro-Ephraimite coalition, and we've shifted now to Jerusalem under Hezekiah, who is concerned with the rising Assyrian threat. And so these oracles against Judah are going to condemn the nation for its corrupt leadership, and also going to denounce Hezekiah specifically for his attempts to form an alliance, a military alliance with Egypt. Now you remember back from chapter 20, Isaiah is going to strip off his clothes and run around naked and say, hey, you silly Isaiah, this is what Egypt is going to look like in a few years when Assyria hauls them off as well. Do you really want to trust in Egypt? No, you're silly. Well, let's see how this idea is picked up in these chapters, starting in chapter 30. Now this word is actually woe. So it's woe, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan, but it is not mine, who make an alliance, but not by my spirit, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking my direction. Don't you realize that Egypt's help is worthless? It is empty. Again, let's go to chapter 31. The same theme is picked up in chapter 31. This time it is translated woe. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on their horses and their chariots. Don't you know that the Egyptians are but man? They are not God, and their horses are of flesh, not of spirit. They cannot save you as I can. All of your human scheming cannot stop the axe of Assyria from coming through your land. However, God will protect his city, and we have those hints of restoration in these chapters as well. Let's look at it in chapter 29, where God promises to protect his city. Let's go back up to chapter 29. This is another woe, woe, Ariel. This is another name for Jerusalem and for Zion, the city where David encamped. I will distress Jerusalem, and there will be moaning and lamentation when Assyria comes in. I will encamp against you all around and besiege you with towers. And yet, the multitude of all your foreign foes, they will become like passing chaff. They will disappear in the wind. And in an instant, suddenly, you will be visited by the Lord of hosts, as with an earthquake and a tempest and a flame of fire. And all those who fight against you will be like a dream, like a vision in the night, which disappear. So we're going to see how and why God defends the city of Jerusalem in chapters 36 to 37. We'll get there in a moment. But you can see how sin and judgment it does not have the last word in the book of Isaiah. For a righteous remnant will be preserved through that judgment and promised a coming kingdom of righteousness over all nations. And it will be ruled by a king, by a righteous king. And that is the subject of the Behold oracle in chapter 32. You can check that one out yourselves. Well, in the same way that chapters 1 to 12 ended with judgment and restoration. And chapters 13 to 27 ended with eschatological judgment and restoration. So, of course, the same thing is true in chapters 34 and 35, where God says that he will bring judgment on all the nations of the earth and also all of the host of heaven, all the spiritual evil as well. That same phrase is picked up from, I believe is it chapter 24 as well. And then also, following this, there will be great restoration where the wilderness, the wilderness which surrounds and is Jerusalem after it is purged, the wilderness will become a garden and it will become a highway for the remnants to return to Zion. Let's look at that language of transformation. Chapter 35. Verse 8, a highway shall be there. The wilderness will be transformed into a garden, and the highway as well will be called a way of holiness. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return. They will come back to Zion with singing and everlasting joy. Gladness and joy will be on their heads. Now, wait a second. A remnant will return to Zion? They never left. At this point in the book, Jerusalem and the Judeans were never taken off into captivity. What's going on here? Well, we need a little bit of historical narrative to connect the dots for us, and that is what chapters 36 to 39 provide. But first, the moment that we have been waiting for, or perhaps dreading. There has been so much anticipation so far in the book of Isaiah that Assyria is coming. Assyria is coming. Assyria is coming. Assyria is coming against Israel, Judah, and all nations. Don't rely on Egypt because Assyria is coming, and Assyria will take out Egypt too. Well, here in chapter 36 and 37, Assyria finally came. Let's see, where are we? And these chapters, 36 and 37, have a very precise structure. And it's pretty neat. I love to demonstrate for you all of the cool design elements in these books as we study them. So let's take a look at the parallel structure in these two chapters with some help from a chart. So this is the siege of Assyria in Jerusalem in chapters 36 and 37. And you see it follows an A, B, C, D double panel structure where there's repetition. Assyria is going to invade and it's going to send Rabshakeh to Jerusalem using the same language. And then Rabshakeh is going to have this arrogant speech about the power of Assyria and how Hezekiah can do nothing to stop them. And then what's Hezekiah's response? He's going to pray in the temple, went to the house of the Lord, and then he's going to call for the prophet Isaiah. He does this twice. See this double panel. And then finally, we see Isaiah's response where he gives a promise of divine salvation. And then after these two panels, there's a conclusion which in a brief account describes Jerusalem's deliverance and the destruction of its enemies. Well, Hezekiah, he's made some mistakes. I mean, with his attempts to make an alliance with Egypt. But here in chapters 36 to 37, it is his moment to shine. It is his moment in the sun. And his faith, the faith of Hezekiah, is seen in sharper relief against the faithlessness of his predecessor and his father, Ahaz. Chapters 7 and 8. And that is exactly, that contrast between Ahaz and Hezekiah is exactly what Isaiah wants us to see in these chapters. Look at the parallels between these two individuals, these two kings of Judah. So we see that in the next chart, where we have Ahaz in chapters 7 and 8, and then Hezekiah in 36 to 37. In both instances, a foreign king is going to go up against Jerusalem. And there's going to be a key encounter which takes place at the exact same location by the conduit of the upper field on the highway to the washman's field, by the conduit of the upper pool. Same exact phrase. And then the Davidic king is going to be greatly distressed when he hears this report, same Hebrew word, nagad. But then Isaiah will give assurance and say, do not be afraid to first Ahaz and then Hezekiah, and he will offer him a sign, which is avat. He will offer him a sign in both instances. But then the two kings are going to respond in two completely opposite ways. Ahaz will not trust in God's deliverance, but Hezekiah will. And unfortunately, we see this in a minute. The city is spared only to fall victim in the future to a greater enemy. Ahaz is spared from the Syro-Ephraimite coalition, only to be destroyed later by Assyria. And then Hezekiah is destroyed initially in 46 cities, and then the city itself is sieged, only to be destroyed later by Babylon, who he invites to his doorstep. And yet there will be a remnant in both cases, and the divine motivation is the same. The zeal of the Lord will accomplish this. That phrase is repeated in both instances. So what's going on here? Why this great contrast? Well, it seems as if Hezekiah is being set up as a type of Messiah, a type of a future coming king who has faith, and through his faith will deliver the city of Jerusalem. You see, Ahaz, through his faithlessness, invited Assyria to his back door, but he's replaced by an Emmanuel figure. Look at chapters 7 and 8, who through his faith will deliver the city. Well, he'll do so for at least 2 chapters, because as we have seen in chapter 39, Hezekiah doesn't look so much like the Messiah anymore, and he is acting not superior to his father, but in the exact same way as his father. And I think that this closing chapter of this big section explains the presence of this kind of rather odd story here in chapter 38. In chapter 38, Hezekiah is going to be healed from a sickness, an illness. And we have this sequence where first there's some kind of trouble. That is, Hezekiah says he's sick, he's going to die. And then he prays, and he prays specifically for God to save him. And then he's given a sign. And then following that reception of a sign, he is delivered. That exact same 5-part sequence we see in chapters 36 to 37 as well. These chapters are mirroring one another. It is as if Hezekiah's healing from his sickness is just like the city of Jerusalem being healed from its foreign oppressors, or more specifically, I believe, being healed from exile, being restored from exile. And I think that this interpretation is strengthened by the intentional deviation that Isaiah makes in the account of 2 Kings. So I said that there's 2 narrative elements in the book of Isaiah, 7 and 8, and then 36 to 39. Well, 36 to 39 are carbon copies of 2 Kings 18 to 20, but they're not exactly the same. There has been some pretty important small changes made to the account in 2 Kings. And let's take a look at some of those changes and speculate on why Isaiah might have altered their contents a bit. So here we are, yet another chart. Oh, so helpful. So here is the sequence as we have it in 2 Kings, where Hezekiah is warned of a fatal illness, and yet and then after he prays, he's promised to be healed. And then in his interaction with Isaiah, there's the account of his being healed through the advocacy of a cake of figs, which is kind of odd. And then Hezekiah requests a sign, like, are these figs really going to heal me? I don't know. I want a sign. And then he is offered a sign. So that's the account in 2 Kings. Notice how things have kind of shifted around a little bit in Isaiah 38, where it begins the same, where there's a fatal illness and promise of healing, although a couple of key elements have been removed here in gray. But then the account of the healing and the request for the sign is taken from its logical position right here, and it's moved all the way to the end. The final verses of Isaiah 38 have this request for a sign. And then following that, there is the offering of a sign, and then a complete addition of a new poem. Hezekiah is going to offer a poem in Isaiah 38, which is not present in 2 Kings 20. So what are some of the, what's the significance of some of these changes? Well, notice this. With the request for a sign, which is placed at the end, in 2 Kings it says, "What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me?" That phrase, "will heal me," is removed. And all it says is, "What is the sign that I shall go up to the house of the Lord?" And the house of the Lord is emphasized strongly in Hezekiah's poem, where he says, "The Lord will save me," but then he extends it to corporate, all of Judah. And we together, corporately, will play music on stringed instruments all the days of our lives at the house of Yahweh. So it seems as if what we have here is the request for a sign to heal the individual Hezekiah is turned into an open-ended and unanswered question at the end of this account, asking now not about the healing of Hezekiah, but about the healing of Judah from its exile to Babylon. When will I come back to the house of the Lord? And it is through that change and the placement of chapter 39 here at the end of this big section that we are launched 150 years into the future into 40 to 66, which concern themselves primarily with Babylon. Now, notice how Isaiah is constantly jerking our attention back and forth between Assyria and Babylon so far in chapters 1 to 39, where we have this concern with Assyria in chapters 1 through 12, and then Babylon in 13 and 14, and then Assyria with all the nations, and then Babylon, the tale of two cities, that evil eschatological city known as Babylon. And then we're back to concern ourselves with Assyria, and then Babylon, and then Assyria, and then Babylon again, launching us all the way into these books, these final chapters. Now, why is that? Well, in chapter 14, verse 26, it seems as if Isaiah is linking these two nations together, these two great foes of Israel. And he says that in 14:26, that this is Yahweh's purpose concerning the whole earth. And we ask, like, what is that purpose? Well, it seems as if Yahweh's purpose for the nations is to raise up a foreign power, first Assyria and then Babylon, and then to use that foreign power to judge his covenant people and all other wicked nations as well. But then he will topple that nation, topple Assyria, and then later he will topple Babylon as well. And the questions that we're asking, once we've been jerked around and we see all these cycles of judgment and sin and restoration, we ask, man, when will all of these cycles end? How will Israel's sin be fully and finally dealt with? And when will Yahweh's kingdom over all nations under the Messiah finally be established? Well, all of that and more in Isaiah 40 to 55 next.